Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
The night had a strange stillness to it, the kind that made your skin crawl. I sat on the couch with my 3-year-old sister Lily, nestled against me. It was Christmas Eve, and the air outside was biting cold, blanketing the city in a deafening quiet. The only sound was the occasional creak of the house as it settled. At 17, I was used to being home alone with Lily. Our mum worked night shifts, leaving me as the default babysitter. Normally it was uneventful, but this night was different, eerily different. The clock struck 9, and Lily was already dozing off, her tiny head resting on my shoulder. I let her stay up a little later than usual, thinking it would make bedtime smoother. Matilda, our usually docile basset hound, lay at our feet. Her snores were soft and rhythmic, a comforting background noise in the otherwise silent house. But then, without warning, Matilda's head shot up. A low, guttural growl rumbled from her throat, a sound I'd never heard from her before. Her floppy ears perked, and the fur along her back bristled. My heart skipped a beat. Matilda was the sweetest dog you'd ever meet. She didn't growl, let alone bark aggressively. Something was wrong. I instinctively scooped Lily into my arms. She stirred but didn't wake fully. I carried her to the bathroom, the only room in the house without windows. "Stay here, okay?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't move, and don't make a sound." Her big sleepy eyes blinked at me as she nodded. I locked the bathroom door from the inside and stepped out, closing it behind me. My pulse quickened as I made my way back to the living room to grab my phone. Matilda's growls grew louder, more menacing. Then it started, a loud, frantic banging on the front door. It wasn't a polite knock, it was desperate, chaotic, as if whoever was on the other side was trying to break the door down. My breath hitched. I crept toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. Peering through the peephole, my stomach twisted into knots. A man stood there, his face smeared with blood. His eyes were wide with panic, darting around as if he expected something or someone to appear out of the shadows. He banged on the door again, his fist leaving smudges of red on the glass pane. Matilda's barking became deafening, her growls vibrating through the floorboards. My legs felt like jelly, but I couldn't look away. The man outside suddenly shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Please, let me in, help me!" Before I could react, a second figure emerged from the darkness. Another man. He launched himself at the bloodied one, fists flying. The two struggled violently, the sounds of grunts and impacts echoing through the door. The first man screamed, his voice breaking as he begged me to let him in. I froze. My mind raced, but I was paralyzed by fear. I was a 17-year-old girl with nothing but a locked door and a barking dog between me and whatever nightmare was unfolding on my porch. My trembling hands finally found my phone and I dialed 911. My voice shook as I tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher. "There are 2 men outside," I stammered. "One's covered in blood. They're fighting. I don't know what to do." The dispatcher's calm voice was a lifeline. "Stay on the line. Help is on the way. Do not open the door." The banging continued, mixed with shouting and the sickening sounds of fists meeting flesh. It felt like hours, though it was only minutes before the noise abruptly stopped. I peeked through the peephole again, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The bloodied man lay slumped on the porch, unmoving. The second man was gone, swallowed by the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as flashing red and blue lights appeared in the distance. Relief flooded my body as a police car screeched to a stop in front of the house. An officer knocked on the door and I fumbled with the lock, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. When I finally opened it, the scene outside left me reeling. Blood smeared the door where the man had been pounding. The officers quickly assessed the situation, one checking on the injured man while another questioned me. Matilda was still growling, her protective instincts in overdrive. Lily's cries echoed from the bathroom, where she was still locked in. The officer's calm demeanor was the only thing keeping me from completely breaking down. They retrieved Lily, her tear-streaked face burying into my shoulder as I held her tightly. The injured man, as it turned out, had been jumped a few blocks away and severely beaten. He'd managed to escape and run to my house for help, but his attacker had followed him, catching up just as he reached my door. The police assured me I'd done the right thing by not opening the door, but that didn't erase the guilt gnawing at me. That night, none of us slept in our own rooms. My mom Lily and I huddled together in her bed, seeking comfort in each other's presence. Matilda lay at the foot of the bed, her watchful eyes scanning the room as if she'd never rest again. Looking back, I know I did what I had to. The man wasn't trying to hurt us. He was terrified and desperate for help, but the guilt remains. A complicated knot of emotions I can't quite untangle. I wonder if he'd felt betrayed, as I stood frozen on the other side of the door, unable to help him in his moment of need. Even now, years later, the sound of frantic banging on a door sends shivers down my spine. It's a reminder of that night, of the helplessness and fear that still lingered just beneath the surface. Some nights I dream of the bloodied man, his desperate eyes staring at me through the peephole, silently asking for help I couldn't give. It began with the kind of silence that feels unnatural, an absence of sound so profound it presses against your ears. That night, the forest across from my home seemed to hold its breath. Even the distant hum of the highway was gone, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. If I'd known what waited for us in the shadows, I never would have stepped outside. I live in a tiny village, barely 10 or 15 houses scattered among rolling fields and dense woods. It's the sort of place where time feels slower, where nature wraps around you like a heavy blanket. The forest, just a 10-minute walk from my front door, had always been a place of peace for me. But that night, it became something else entirely. It was the first day of Christmas, and after hours of indulging in festive feasting, my partner and I decided to go for a walk to shake off the lethargy. It was already dark, the clock barely pushing past 5 p.m., but the idea of crisp, cold air and the crunch of snow beneath our boots felt irresistible. Armed with a bright LED flashlight and my camera, I loved capturing nighttime shots of nature. We set off down the narrow country road toward the forest. The plan was simple: take the gravel cycling path that skirted the forest's edge. The path connected our village to the next, a short 15 to 20-minute walk. In the middle, the trees closed in tightly, creating a stretch of dense darkness that had always felt a little eerie but never threatening. That night, though, it felt different. As we approached the forest's edge, the flashlight beam caught something reflective up ahead. A car. My partner and I exchanged a puzzled glance. Vehicles weren't allowed on this path, and it was so secluded that driving there would be almost impossible without someone noticing. We walked closer, and the flashlight revealed more. The car's windows were frosted over, its body coated in a fine layer of ice. It must have been sitting there for hours. Strange, but not entirely alarming. Maybe someone had abandoned it. Nearby, a gnarled tree with an unusual shape caught my eye. I asked my partner to hold the flashlight steady while I crouched down to frame a shot with my camera. The flash illuminated the twisted branches, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. There's someone standing behind us," my partner said, voice low and tight. My stomach dropped. Slowly I turned, expecting to see a wild animal or maybe another late-night walker. Instead, a man stood just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. He wasn't moving, wasn't speaking, just staring. My first instinct was to rationalize. Maybe he'd been startled by our presence. Maybe he'd parked his car there for some reason. Forcing calm into my voice, I called out, "Hi there! Just taking some photos. Is this your car?" He didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. The flashlight's beam caught the edge of his face, pale and expressionless. My partner shifted uneasily beside me. "Do you need some light?" I tried again. Finally he spoke, his voice flat and emotionless. "That's not necessary." The weight of his gaze made the air feel heavier, colder. My partner and I exchanged a glance, the unspoken agreement clear. It was time to leave. We turned and walked briskly toward the next village, the crunch of snow underfoot loud in the oppressive silence. My heart thudded in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. When we finally reached the first streetlight in the neighboring village, I risked a glance back. The uneasy feeling that had been clawing at me intensified. The car, the one we'd seen parked in the forest, was moving. Its headlights were off, and it crept slowly along the path, pausing as if deciding whether to follow us further. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the shadows. We hurried home, taking the long route to avoid passing through the forest again. The flashlight's battery died halfway, leaving us stumbling in near darkness. My phone was barely holding a charge, and I didn't want to risk draining it completely. By the time we reached our house, the sense of relief was palpable. But the unease didn't fade. At home, I couldn't stop thinking about the man, his car, and his unsettling behavior. I Googled the partial license plate I'd managed to glimpse. My stomach sank. The car was registered to a city 6 hours away from our village. And here's the kicker. Our country was under a strict lockdown. Travel of that distance was prohibited unless it was for an emergency. What could possibly have brought him here, to this remote forest path, on a night like this? The realization hit me later as I replayed the events in my mind. The frosted windows on his car. They suggested it had been sitting there, untouched, for hours, and yet somehow, he had been behind us, silent and deliberate. How had he gotten there? The thought chilled me to my core. He hadn't just been watching us. He'd been following us, sneaking up on us while I was distracted with my camera. The implications were horrifying. What if I'd been alone? What if we hadn't decided to leave when we did? I called the police as soon as we were safely inside, giving them every detail I could remember. But without the full license plate or any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Days passed, the snow melted, and spring began to creep into the village. But the memory of that night lingered like a shadow at the edge of my vision. Now every time I see snow falling, I think of him, the way he stood there, unnervingly still, the way his car crept through the darkness like a predator stalking prey. And I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, somewhere, waiting, watching. Some silences aren't natural, some shadows aren't empty, and some moments stay with you forever. The store lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows down the empty aisles, as if the fluorescent bulbs themselves sensed something was off. I didn't notice at first. My focus was on my daughter, her small hand clasped tightly in mine as she hummed a tune only she seemed to know. Just shy of 18 months, she was my entire world, my light in an otherwise dark, crumbling reality. My wife and I no longer lived together. Our home life fractured under the weight of her increasing volatility, but none of that mattered here. Today it was just my daughter and me on one of our little routines. Only this time, we wouldn't make it home unchanged. It was a little after 4 p.m. when she woke from her nap, her tiny face flushed with the warmth of sleep. The days had a rhythm to them. She'd wake, I'd gather what we needed, and off to the store we'd go. My mom helped out wherever she could, but for moments like this, it was just us. The aisle stretched endlessly before us as we wandered, her energy spilling into every step she took. She was curious about everything: bright cereal boxes, colorful cans on lower shelves, even the hum of the coolers lining the walls. I usually held her hand, matching her pace no matter how slow, but my arms were heavy with bags of flour, noodles, and a gallon of milk. So I walked a step behind her, urging her forward when she stopped to marvel at something new. When we finally reached the registers, she had begun to grow restless, tugging at the edges of her little jacket. Register 1 was open, but the cashier was busy handling a return. While we waited, I knelt down to entertain her with a few rounds of patty cake, her laughter filling the space like a tiny beacon. But her real joy came from greeting people. "Hi," she squeaked, waving at every stranger who passed by. Most waved back, smiling at her charm. Others stopped to tell her how adorable she was. I never imagined that her sweet, innocent enthusiasm would invite something dark into our lives. The moment came quickly, like a fracture in reality. 1 second I was pulling out my debit card, eyes locked on my daughter as she stood just a few feet away. The next, the cashier's voice sliced through the air like a siren. "What are you doing with his daughter?" she screamed, her voice a thunderclap that froze me in place. I turned, my stomach dropping as I saw him, a stranger clutching my child, her tiny form dangling in his arms like a rag doll. He was heading for the doors, moving fast. My mind blanked, shock rooting me to the floor, and the spell broke, and instinct took over. The doors wouldn't open. They were one way only, and for a fleeting moment I felt relief. The man stopped, his head jerking left and right, searching for another way out. My hands shook as I reached for the pocket knife I always carried, but something in me hesitated. I didn't want to escalate this wrong, not with my daughter in his arms. Instead, I ran. The man turned, startled by the sound of my pounding footsteps. As he hesitated, I lunged, my fist connecting with his temple in a desperate, adrenaline-fueled blow. He stumbled, his grip loosening just enough for me to snatch my daughter back. She clung to me, her small arms wrapping tightly around my neck as sobs racked her tiny frame. Relief and terror surged through me in waves as I backed away, clutching her like she was the only thing tethering me to reality. The man didn't stick around. He bolted through the entrance doors, disappearing into the cold night. The police arrived within minutes, their presence a mix of comfort and unease. I gave them my statement, though there wasn't much I could tell them. The man's face had been obscured by a tangle of shaggy hair, a beard, and a dark hoodie. Witnesses described the same thing, a shadowy figure who had vanished before anyone could intervene. One officer mentioned seeing him run behind the building, but by the time they searched, he was long gone. They assured me we were safe, but their questions didn't stop. Had I seen him before? Did I know anyone who might look like him? Their inquiries turned toward our home life, questions about my estranged wife, about CPS visiting earlier that day to discuss her mental health. It felt like an interrogation, but I answered everything. When they finally left, one officer lingered, handing me a card with his number. "Call if you see anything suspicious," he said. I nodded, my daughter still clinging to me like she could sense the lingering danger. 20 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. I hesitated, every nerve on edge. Peering through the peephole, I saw the officers again, but this time they weren't empty-handed. They carried a giant box of diapers, packs of wipes, grocery bags filled to the brim, and a couple of large sacks holding toys. I opened the door, speechless, as they handed everything over. Among the bags was a Christmas card. Inside, in neat handwriting, were the words, "You're a strong father. Your daughter is lucky to have you. Stay safe." Tucked within was $100 and a small note. "Get a drink or two if you need it." I don't drink, but that money would go toward making this Christmas brighter for my daughter and my mum. That night, as I watched her play with her new toys, her giggles filling our small living room, I felt the weight of everything settle over me. Fear, relief, gratitude. It all blended together in a bittersweet cocktail of emotions. The darkness had come for us, but we had survived. For now, that was enough.